President Biden raises international issues during his address to Congress. What is the global reaction? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. U.S. President Joe Biden unveiled major plans to invest in America during his address to a joint session of the United States Congress on Wednesday. But he also talked about foreign policy issues. He discussed the China-U.S. relationship, and he talked about Russia and Iran. Biden also weighed in on plans for the U.S. to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. We have a great international panel to discuss all of this. Joining us now from San Francisco is Bruce McConnell. He is president and CEO of the EastWest Institute. Also with us from Beijing is Qinduo. He is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution, and he's the host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. With us here in Washington, D.C. is Anton Fedyashin. He is a Russian expert and a professor of history at American University. And joining us too is Trita Parsi. He is an expert on U.S.-Iran relations and is executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Welcome to all of you. Bruce McConnell, let me start with you. And before we get into the details of the foreign policy issues in that speech that the president made, what was your overall impression? What did you glean from that speech about the president's foreign policy priorities?
Thanks very much. What a great panel you put together. I'm awed by the experts. I think the president is demonstrating a clear understanding of why he was elected and what the American people expect from him now. He knows how to persevere. This president knows how to persevere in the face of adversity. He's getting the pandemic under control, creating American jobs, repairing America's critical infrastructure, and maintaining a strong national defense. He's rebuilding America's traditional alliances, and on the foreign policy front, he's withdrawing from Afghanistan, responding to Russian provocations, negotiating with Iran, and staying firm on China. His popularity is high, and he's off to a strong start.
All right, let's talk about that withdrawal from Afghanistan. This is what the president had to say. Let's listen.
Today, we have service members serving in the same war zone as their parents did. We have service members in Afghanistan who were not yet born on 9/11. We degraded the terrorist threat of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And after 20 years of valor, and sacrifice, it's time to bring those troops home.
So Bruce, Biden also talked there about this never being about nation building. But after 20 years of war, the question has to be asked, what did the U.S. achieve there?
Well, I think the president is finishing up the work that Presidents Obama and Trump began, which is to withdraw U.S. forces while maintaining support for the Afghan military. The stated U.S. goal was to deny al-Qaeda a safe haven, and that has been achieved during the time U.S. forces have been there. However, as the British learned in the 19th century and the Russians learned in the 20th century, Afghanistan is not a place that a foreign power can win militarily. So we hope that the Afghan military can maintain sufficient stability while the government negotiates with the Taliban so the country can become an economic and political success.
Anton Fedyashin, of course, the United States short-term goals were achieved very quickly in Afghanistan. The Taliban was overthrown, and al-Qaeda didn't have any kind of sanctuary in the country any longer. Let's talk about the Russian experience there. Russia was also involved in Afghanistan. It withdrew as well. But now, with the U.S. withdrawal, could we see the return of the Taliban? Could we see al-Qaeda coming back as well? In fact, reportedly, al-Qaeda is making threats that it will attack the United States again. I mean, could we see more violence and instability?
I think, unfortunately, Anand, we're guaranteed to see more violence and instability because the Taliban has not only not been defeated, they are stronger now than they were, let's say, 10 years ago. And the United States, after 20 years of sacrificing life and an enormous amount of money, is negotiating with the same people, negotiating a withdrawal, let me be clear, with the very people that it went in there to overthrow. Look, I agree with my colleague who just spoke that, yes, Afghanistan has proven that it is the graveyard of empires. What's stunning to me is that the United States genuinely believed in 2001. And for the past 20 years, that its experience would somehow be profoundly different from the Soviet, the British, the Russian, and even the ancient Greek under Alexander of Macedonia. I mean, this is a very long history. So unfortunately, yes, Al-Qaeda has been kicked out, but that is only a function of the United States and NATO being there. The moment they're gone, the Taliban is going to take over, and then the radicals will probably, unfortunately, reemerge.
Bruce, some important points that Anton brings up there. I mean, this morphed from an anti-terror operation really into a nation-building mission, and that was a mistake, wasn't it?
I think it's right. I mean, Afghanistan is a place with great economic potential. It has the makings of a trade crossroads, but in recent centuries, it has been isolated. It's in a place of instability and civil war. Warring factions have been a feature of Afghani governance for many years, and I think it'd be naive to think that that will not continue.
Qinduo, this is South Asia, very close to China. China, of course, has major investments in the region. I'm thinking especially of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. Beijing, of course, is also concerned about any kind of instability in that part of the world. I mean, how is China viewing these developments?
Well, for China, I think, largely people agree, the U.S., after the U.S. withdraw, you will see Taliban will, take over the country in a couple of years, depending on, it's a matter of time. And then you will see probably during this period of time, you will see the upsurge of more violence. And then you will be dealing with a different country over there, different practice. And then the danger is like, Al-Qaeda probably could come back and then thrive there. Who knows, like 10 years from now, what will happen? Whether we will prioritize, terrorism again for the United States. And of course, for China too, for Russia too, because people are concerned about instability, people are concerned about terrorism, extremism in this region. So in that sense, but China is dealing with Afghanistan in a different way. Obviously, China is learning the lesson. You don't want to have a military presence in this country, graveyard of big powers. Mm-hmm. You want to deal with that problem, more trade, more investment, whatever regime over there. You want to deal with them probably to enable the people, to empower the people. When people have a better life, when people enjoy staying at home, or enjoying their whatever in the gadgets over there, they don't go outside and or don't easily, be easily radicalized by those ideas. So hopefully things will get better overall.
Trita, Parsi, the pullout from Afghanistan, it seems to be part of a wider move by the United States to get out of the Middle East, to get out of South Asia. You've written about this. In fact, you wrote a great piece in Foreign Policy. You were talking specifically about these very nascent contacts between Saudi Arabia and Iran, saying that, look, they have to find their own ways to get to some kind of diplomatic agreement right now without the United States. But what is your view on this and Biden's talk of ending what he calls the forever wars?
Well, step one, obviously, is to end the war in Afghanistan. And I think what was striking with the manner in which Biden defended this is that it wasn't an apologetic defense. He went at the very core of the logic of the endless wars and defied those and argued strongly against them. I think the same logic that he presented there can easily be used to pull out the troops out of Iraq, pull out the troops out of Syria, and cease to have a policy of seeking to dominate the Middle East militarily. It has not stabilized the Middle East, and it certainly has not made the United States any safer. The reality in Afghanistan, I think, is important to note as well, is that whether the United States were to leave or stay, fighting and violence was extremely likely to increase regardless. The only thing Biden could control is whether that fighting would involve American troops or whether those American troops would be home with their families. And recognizing the limitations of what the United States could do here, I think was a rather courageous move. It frankly would have been easier for Biden to do what previous presidents have done, which is just to kick the can down the road and hope that it would be the headache of the next president.
Trita, of course, the United States has often said that the reason for it wanting to have military dominance in the Middle East and other parts of the world was not because it had any kind of colonial aspirations, but because it was in the interests of United States security. But now that it's pulling out, does it feel that its security is no longer threatened by what goes on in these regions?
I think that was because of an exaggerated and overexpansive definition of U.S. interests. I think the U.S.'s interest in the region is primarily to make sure that there is no other power that emerges as a hegemon that is hostile to the United States and as a result would be able to control the resources of the region. That does not require the United States to be the hegemon. It just needs to be able to have the ability to prevent any other potential hegemon. Right now, there are no realistic candidates, which as a result means that there is no necessity for the United States to have permanent troops there. Secondly, is to protect oil and the global commerce. And there again, while that is an important interest, it does not necessitate permanent U.S. bases, 58,000 troops, 19 bases in the region to be able to achieve that. I think 40 years ago, perhaps one could have made the argument that the strategic significance of the Middle East is far greater than it is today. But today, you can't make that argument. Today, it's clear its strategic significance have dwindled, and as a result, the United States should be adjusting accordingly. It's been very difficult for the United States to do so because of inertia, political interest, and many other things. But after 3 presidents promising to do so, I think for the first time, we're actually seeing it happening for real.
Okay, let's move on to the China-United States relationship. President Biden spent quite a bit of time in that speech talking about that relationship. It has been called the most important bilateral relationship in the world. Biden talked about the relationship with China, and he talked about it in the context of the United States economy as well. Let's listen again.
The investments I propose tonight also advance the foreign policy, in my view, that benefits the middle class. That means making sure every nation plays by the same rules in the global economy, including China. In my discussion with President Xi, I told him, we welcome the competition. We're not looking for conflict.
So, Qinduo, here we have the president there. He's talking tough on China. What's been the response in Beijing?
Well, people will ask questions, when President Biden, speak of seeking competition but not conflicts. But somehow the rhetoric, is not really matching, or people asking if the rhetoric is matching the action or the policy, in particular in Asia-Pacific region, for example. We see the escalation over Taiwan, is obviously there is more and more danger. People are alarmed what will happen, and should China and the United States sit down and talk to each other to make sure there is peace and stability, that will continue. And if you look at the South China Sea, more U.S. aircraft carrier and also more Chinese warships over there. So there's also a danger for somehow kind of incident. And the U.S. is continuing or strengthening its alliance with, for example, with Japan for the first time in 69 years, several decades. In their joint statement, they talked about Taiwan in their bilateral relationship. And you have a Quad after the new administration, where you have Biden together with leaders from India, Japan, and Australia. Everybody knows that they're targeting China. So how the Biden administration and China are going to deal with each other? Obviously, we are seeing a continuation of a more confrontational approach toward China, as like a more expansion from the last year, at least from the Trump administration, and also in some area you are seeing an enhanced version of this confrontational approach toward China. We are seeing very little cooperation. Only you can see like President Xi Jinping joined the Earth Day Summit. That's all on climate change. Other areas you see nothing, including trade. Many people expected there will be a change of at least the tariffs will be reduced. Obviously, no, they are still there. So you do see more, competition or confrontation, or more confrontation than competition. Competition probably, at least to a large extent, is really doing a good job at domestically, so you can compete.
Bruce McConnell, that is right, isn't it? The president has taken a very tough line on China. He, in fact, has not changed, reversed, or modified in any way the very hardline policies that were taken by former President Donald Trump. The president has talked about competition, he's talked about conflict, and he says competition, not conflict. But is it actually the other way around? It's conflict, not competition.
Well, I think there are many areas of disagreement between the U.S. and China, and both countries, that's kind of normal. the competition is normal and it leads to innovation and efficiency, but I think using inflamed rhetoric to insult a competitor only reduces the ability to make progress, like my Chinese colleague said. I mean, if we were in normal times, perhaps this verbal competition and confrontation, which is mostly verbal at this point, maybe this would not be a problem, but we're not in normal times. The two greatest powers must work together on global problems like the pandemic, terrorism, cybersecurity, and climate change. Meanwhile, we must work out our differences on trade and security matters. So the president talked later about the winning the 21st century. And I think that this finding of win-win solutions on these major crises is what that actually means. No one can win by themselves in this game on the planet today. We're all into it. We're all in it together.
Qinduo, that is a mantra that we've heard from China very often, win-win. This is not a zero-sum game, but where do you see the relationship going in the short term? I mean, there is some common ground, as you pointed out, especially on things like climate change, but where does it go to from there?
Yeah, well, I think in the short term...
Well, that's right.
Sorry.
Bruce, I'll get to you. Qinduo, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's more or less the Chinese side for a lot of people they're still waiting to see a more comprehensive China policy out of the Biden administration.
Right.
They are not talking to each other about trade. They are not talking to each other about other issues except for climate change. This only area, for example, pandemic cooperation. Can the two countries cooperate and then play a leading role to help the world to eradicate this virus? Because this is critical not only say to India or to China or to the United States individually. It is about the survival of the human being, or at least for this year or next year. And then climate change and a lot of issues that need cooperation between the two largest powers here.
Bruce, very briefly, I want to move on to Russia policy, but go ahead and tell us what you were thinking.
I think my Chinese colleague said it very well. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, let's move on to what the president said about Russia. Anton Fedyashin, President Biden also talked very tough on Russia. He said he wasn't seeking any kind of deterioration, escalation in the relationship with Russia. But how does Russia see this relationship?
Well, listen, the Russians aren't expecting any improvements at this point. They adopted a position of strategic patience a while ago, so they're just going to wait out and see what happens. There's absolutely no change in the substance of the relationship, believe it or not, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. The Trump administration imposed wave after wave of sanctions, and although President Trump himself spoke positively, surprisingly positively, about Putin and Russia, no one else in his administration did, and the record speaks for itself. So the Russians aren't going to be taken in by the rhetoric. They understand that this is going to be a tough relationship. But on the other hand, they have offered many times to work through many differences, including the cybersecurity issue. They are not thrilled about the United States and NATO leaving Afghanistan, by the way, contrary to what the dominant sort of belief is inside the Beltway, because the Russians understand perfectly well, it's their neighborhood after all, that a vacuum in Afghanistan does not bode well for anyone in the region, including themselves. So I think that everyone's going to be looking very carefully at this summit that looks like is in the planning stages for the summer. Today, by the way, the Chancellor of Austria, Sebastian Kurz, offered Vienna as a potential venue for the meeting between Biden and Putin. If it takes place, the Russians, I think, are going to come to this meeting with a set of proposals to see what's going to work out with the Americans. There's a feeling in Moscow that the tough rhetoric that they heard from the Biden administration and the expulsion of the diplomats and the sanctions are a preparation for a more pragmatic approach towards Moscow. So we'll just have to wait and see for the summer how this works out.
Right. Anton, very quickly, you talked about strategic patience. What is Russia waiting for?
Russia's waiting for the United States to put pressure on the Ukrainians to fulfill the Minsk agreement that the previous Ukrainian President Poroshenko signed. That's number one. And Ukraine is a major point of disagreement. The second issue that the Russians are waiting for is to see what the United States decides to do in Syria, and whether the U.S. is fine with Assad remaining in power, but then having his power limited by some kind of new political agreement. Now, whether the Russians and the others in the region are ready and capable of pulling that off, it's impossible to tell right now. But the whole Assad must go and Assad is unacceptable, first of all, that's already been shelved by the United States. That happened under the Obama administration. The Russians are now waiting to see to what extent the United States will really start pulling out of the Middle East and allowing the regional players to determine the outcome of the conflicts in the countries.
Trita, Parsi, President Biden, of course, also talked about Iran in that speech, and he talked about Iran in a joint reference to North Korea as well. Let's listen to what he had to say.
On Iran and North Korea, nuclear programs that present serious threats to American security and the security of the world. We're going to be working closely with our allies to address the threats posed by both of these countries through diplomacy as well as stern deterrence.
So, Trita, where do you see the Iran-U.S. relationship going? I mean, here we have a president right now who was part of a previous administration that signed a significant nuclear deal with Iran. But, you know, there's now some concern about the U.S. going back to that deal.
Well, I think those concerns about the U.S. hesitating or not having plans to go back were probably more valid in the first 2 months of Biden's presidency, in which there was hardly any movement. And frankly, there was a rhetoric used by the Biden administration that seemed to indicate that the fault of the responsibility for this crisis was on the Iranian shoulders, not on Trump's pullout of the deal, and that the Iranians had to make the first move. That has now changed. For the last 2 or so months, negotiations have been taking place in Vienna. They have been very slow for a variety of reasons, but they are progressing, and both sides seem to be quite serious about getting to some sort of an agreement. The question is, will they be able to do so before the Iranian elections, which could be a big game changer in all of this. But I would say that at this point, I think it's quite clear the Biden administration wants to get back into the agreement. It is actually a critical element of a broader strategy of being able to disengage from the Middle East militarily.
There have been several efforts to sabotage recently, Iran's nuclear program. That's been making news. We know that there are elements in the world that would not like to see this agreement go back on track. Would both sides be able to overcome that, look past that, and get the JCPOA back on track?
You're quite correct. In particular, the Saudis, the Israelis, and the Emiratis have been quite opposed to the agreement. The rest of the world tends to be quite supportive of it, though. And they have, or at least in the case of the Israelis, have acted quite aggressively and tried to sabotage Biden's diplomacy and make it as difficult as possible for him to be able to return. And Bibi Netanyahu in Israel took credit for Trump pulling out of the agreement and has lauded it as a major achievement of his own premiership. But I do think that the fact that this explosion took place in Natanz and the talks continued in Vienna, that the Iranians went up to 60%, but it didn't deter the United States from continuing to engage in diplomacy, is an indication that the political will on the both sides is sufficiently strong, and they have now managed more or less to insulate the negotiations in Vienna away from these attempts by the Israelis and others to sabotage these negotiations.
Right, and briefly, Trita, you talked about the Iranian election. How will that impact what the United States does or doesn't do?
Well, it will have an impact whether the United States acknowledges it or not, because by, I believe, May 18th, the Iranian Guardian Council is going to announce who will be permitted to run for president in Iran. And at that point, the Iranian election season will begin in earnest. And the high likelihood is that the vast majority of the candidates, at least of the conservatives, will be highly critical of not just the JCPOA, but the ongoing negotiations. So the already very limited maneuverability that the Iranian negotiators have in Vienna will be even further limited and make the prospects of reaching a deal more difficult. And that's part of the reason why it's important for all sides to move as fast as possible right now, before these natural deadlines in terms of elections start to come in.
Bruce McConnell, I'm going to turn to another issue right now. This is not so much a foreign policy issue as much as a domestic issue. President Biden talked about the challenge to U.S. democracy posed by groups inside the country, within the country. He referenced the January 6th rampage on Capitol Hill at the U.S. Congress. But if you look at this from a foreign perspective, how damaging was this to the world's view of the United States?
Well, I think the world's view of the United States went downhill quite a bit in the previous administration. So we have a lot of work to do as a nation to build back better, both inside the country and address these divisions inside the country that have come to the fore and were very evident during and after the election and even up to the inauguration, as well as addressing those things, globally on a global basis. I mean, if we want to, as the Chinese like to say, if we want to build a community of common destiny for mankind, you need strong partners. And I think America is building back better and will be one of those partners.
Anton, for decades, the United States has been telling us that it has seen external forces, especially groups in the Middle East, as posing the greatest threat to its national security. But in that speech, the president said that white supremacy now poses the most lethal threat to the United States. Did that surprise you?
I think it's overdue to recognize that. Yeah.
Anton, go ahead.
No, it didn't surprise me because, look, that's been sort of the narrative of the Democratic Party, and it has every right to be spoken. Look, the Biden administration seems to be turning inwards in terms of prioritizing domestic problems. And a lot of countries around the world will see that as a very positive sign because, honestly, the American record in the Middle East, the regime change experiments, including, by the way, the one in Ukraine, beyond the Middle East, have really not resulted in terribly positive developments. So I think everyone welcomes the United States as a partner at the table when negotiating important international issues, including in the Middle East, but just not as a leader that goes in bombing first and then figuring out who it is that they're bombing and what the culture and the political culture and the history of the country is before sending in boots on the ground. The United States has always had it's been blessed as a country, it has had the luxury of choosing its wars and then being able to withdraw from them without really any permanent damage to the homeland, which is not something you can say for most Eurasian countries. So I think the world welcomes the Biden administration's restraint, but we'll see to what degree that lasts before the Washington blob takes over.
And that's where we have to leave it. That was a great discussion. Thanks to all of you for being with us. We need to leave it there. We've run out of time. And thank you for joining us on another edition of The Heat. Have a great weekend.